most of you have your staff report and your minutes of the decision of the case study. Has anybody not found the staff report and the minutes of the decision of your case study? Anybody that has not found those items? Okay.
Never sorted that out.
Sometimes some local governments do something called an action agenda or a results agenda, and all they do is they restate what's on the agenda and just indicate what the vote was. I would hope that you find the minutes. Now, some local governments takes them a very, very long time to actually post minutes. So if no minutes are available, then no minutes are available. But it's the minutes that will tend to reflect more of the, include more of the deliberation.
So default is the agenda. Default is the agenda.
It is, but if you find the results agenda or the action agenda, but you don't find the minutes, and they have a video posted, a lot of local governments also have video links, go listen to your item on the video, because you're going to want to understand that part of this study is getting in the heads of those decision makers a little bit and understanding from their deliberation why they voted the way they did, why they reached the conclusion that they did. Okay. All right. Okay. So we were in the, I'm going to pass quickly through some of the stuff we went over last week. We got into environmental regulation, which is a field of regulation that is adjacent, so to speak, to land use. It has a different purpose. It, to protect the air, water, land, and public health in that respect. It has a similar purpose in the protection of the public health, safety, and welfare, which is what undergirds land use law. But it is adjacent. It tends to be administered by a different set of regulatory bodies and staff. It's more science-based than we'll find in the field of land use regulation. It can have a tremendous impact on the outcome of a development project. Did somebody keep my pen? There we go. Toss the pen. For next time. You need a pen? Always Okay, so what are some of the ways in which environmental regulation will affect, I'll go back here, that's real fast, but what are some of the ways in which environmental regulation could affect a land development project?
You can delay it.
It could delay it, yes, because the permit processes run separately and on their own timetable. It could. Is it likely to delay the approval of a development project or the construction, or might it delay both?
Both.
Yeah. Although most of the time you can move them in stair step. Like you get approval of one subject to the approval of the other. So you can get to the finish line of an approval, but you're not going to be able to actually start construction until you get all those environmental permits in hand, typically. What are some other ways? Time, so they can delay approval, it can delay commencement of construction of a project. What else can affect
costs?
It can increase costs. How would environmental regulation increase costs? Wetland, what were you going to say?
We get to produce additional environmental impact studies, they might request more studies on what your exact plans and that site.
Okay, the soft costs of doing the studies, yes. What would the presence of wetland would have what impact on cost?
Now you have to spend money to actually create a wetland if you're going to build on a wetland, you can spend money now from the wetlands bank.
Mitigation, yeah, performing wetland mitigation, which is
Yes.
expensive, especially because it has to be monitored for years. And if it doesn't thrive, they'll make you go in and redo it. So, okay, any other ways that you can think of it that environmental regulation could have an impact on your development project?
Like tree mitigation can cost money, and then the wetlands can limit the amount of buildable space, and both of them.
Yes.
You can make.
Yes. So wetlands, there's like a tiered process of wetland review. They ask you to avoid impacting the wetlands, to minimize impacting the wetlands, and then mitigate. So you've got to show the environmental regulators that first of all, you've designed your project in such a way as to avoid the wetlands if possible. And you'll see this you can see this in suburban development, in corporate parks, in multifamily development. You'll see the buildings arrayed in a very, it might be a nice big rectangular piece of property, but the buildings are arranged oddly because they have a preserve. They have a wetland preserve that they have been required to maintain. Now, thankfully, those wetland preserves can often be used for stormwater retention also, as long as all of the structures are designed to provide pre-treatment of hazardous materials, to filter out the bad stuff from the runoff. They'll allow you to use those wetlands for stormwater retention. And you're going to have to provide stormwater retention in your project too. So you can do all that, but it's true. It can reduce the overall acreage that is available for development.
How does a building make the water cleaner before it goes into the pond?
How does a building?
Yeah, you're kind of.
Well, they do drainage structures that direct the water into filtration trenches that then allow the water to percolate into the groundwater and be somewhat clean.
And an example of that would be xeriscaping, which we don't do a lot of here, but they do a lot of in places like Arizona and more drier climates.
What type of farming?
Well, xeriscape uses plants for landscaping that don't require much water.
But a lot of times
But we're talking about is really it's an engineering function of the runoff from the parking lots and the roof and into all of that has to go through a certain amount of pre-treatment
It's not like sewage
before it's
water.
allowed.
It's not sewage water.
No, it's stormwater runoff. Yeah, not sewage. So then when the sewage gets treated and it comes back through little blue pipes, in some areas of some cities, they have a reuse water supply. And they'll require, if they have that available, they'll require building developers to put in the lines for reuse. That means that the water that's coming out of the sewage plant is going back into the system, not as potable water, not as drinking water, but as water that feeds plumbing and things, and irrigation maybe, and things like that.
Pompano Beach has that.
Reuse system. Hollywood did too. I just don't remember if it ever really came into fruition. Okay, so these are some of the ways in which environmental regulations will create burdens for your project and will create delays, but it's something you have to be aware of in the scope of your project, in doing your pro forma, in setting up your schedule, to understand what regulatory procedures your project is going to have to go through. What permits are you going to have to get and when? And it really comes down to hiring a good consulting team. And let me ask you this. Do you think that the environmental regulation comes from only the federal government or the state government or the local government?
Both.
All three.
All three?
Yes, generally all three. So remember, we kind of did a quick walk through how environmental policy and environmental regulation has developed in the United States. It started with a focus on land preservation for beneficial use. That is, how can we get the most out of our land rather than preservation? In the early 70s, these really essential set of federal laws were enacted to protect our air and water. It's hard to imagine that these could have been, that something like this legislation could be enacted today, right? Hard to believe, but we have them, and different administrations will try to strengthen them, and others will try to undercut them, but here they still are. The environmental NEPA is a procedural law. So what does that mean? If a project requires a study under NEPA because a federal agency is involved, what does NEPA do to your process?
Delays, increased costs.
Yes, because they study, it can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in consultants' fees to do an environmental impact statement for a project.
How long does that take?
A couple of years.
Oh, wow.
I'm not an expert in this process, but it does involve hiring consultants. So typically the federal agency hires them, but whoever is the developer of the project pays for them. And that can take a very long time because you have to follow federal procurement laws in the selection of the consultant. And then they have scoping meetings, months and months and months of scoping meetings, trying to figure out what they're going to study, what the extent of the study will be. And they have public hearings about the scope, and they have to create records of all of the comments that were received at the public hearings. It goes on and on and on. It's a very lengthy process. But the type of projects you would encounter this, like I said, with an airport project, because the FAA has to approve most significant projects at airports, or a port project, or a road, or a bridge, or something that involves a federal action. A P3, you know what a P3 is, so a public-private partnership to build an office building for a federal agency, which would, to you as a developer, would look and feel just like any other development, but it's not. It's a federal action. And it doesn't matter what the outcome of the study is necessarily for NEPA. As long as the process was followed, generally the agency can win on appeal if someone challenges it. The Clean Water Act regulates point source pollution. This is the source of the no net loss policy for managing wetlands that require that you avoid, minimize, and then mitigate. The mitigation always involves an enhanced percentage. Like if you are going to destroy 1 acre of wetlands, you're going to probably have to mitigate 3 to 1. You're going to have to create 3 acres or something like that. I don't know what the percentage is right now, but it's always a multiplied percentage. The Endangered Species Act, right? If you do an environmental assessment of your property and you find protected species, you're going to have to deal with them. Or if you find not even the animals, but the nesting or foraging areas and so on, the habitat of the animals, that's the word I was looking for. The Clean Air Act. Under state regulations that fall under the Clean Air Act, the Federal Clean Air Act, and then state regulations, if you have a project with a very large parking garage, all of that car emissions in a concentrated place inside a structure where it's difficult to dissipate it, you're going to have to go get an air license for a parking garage. So parking garage is great, you're going to use less land, you're going to keep more land for development. It's taking, Parking garage is great, but you're gonna have to get an air license. So even if these things can creep into your project in unexpected ways. Okay. All right, so we touched on all that already. I'm gonna touch on airport zoning a little bit because, again, it's something that can take you by surprise at the end of a project to find that you're, in your perspective, you're far away from an airport. But because of the nature of the equipment that's used at airports, it can still have an effect on you. So airport zoning requires that airports and the adjacent local governments around airports coordinate to zone the land around the airport in a way that is compatible with the airport. So this state law, and it's based on federal regulations, says in the battle between airport and quiet city, airport wins. That's really the premise of this, that the state is saying the investment in the public infrastructure of an airport is so high and it's so valuable, and the protection of airspace for safety is so important that you cities who do zoning must, oh my goodness, look at that. That city zoning must be made compatible with the airport and not the other way around generally. But that doesn't mean that cities near airports are happy with that, or that they want to encourage unlimited development of airports. So let's think, go ahead.
You said the investment was so high and the safety regulations are high as well, that what?
That in the balance, the protection, zoning, to make zoning compatible with the airport is more important than the effect on the community. So let's think about some examples. Okay, there's a pretty new runway on the south side of Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport, and the city of Dania Beach opposed it for years and years and years and years and years, and filed lawsuits over it. Their reasons were twofold: noise for the residential areas near the airport, and loss of tax revenue. Because when the county bought land to expand the airport, it pulled it off the tax revenue. And that was a city that needed that tax revenue. So the one purpose was legitimate, so to speak. The city had a legitimate interest in protecting its people, if they could, from the noise of aircraft flights. They really didn't have a legitimate interest in protecting themselves from the loss of tax revenue, because tax revenue moves around. When property comes into public use and comes off the tax roll, it's just, one taxing entity doesn't have favoritism over another one. Does that kind of make sense? Nonetheless, when Broward County needed to acquire land for that airport expansion, they went to the legislature and they made a deal that transferred into the city of Dania Beach taxable industrial land to replace the commercial land that was being acquired for airport purposes. So the tank farm in Port Everglades, a big part of it, is now in the city of Dania Beach, when it didn't used to be in the city of Dania Beach, so that they would have that replacement tax revenue. So even though that wasn't really a legit basis for the city to challenge the county's acquisition of land, it was recognized as a political issue. So they all went to the legislature and they found a political solution, and that was the transfer of land jurisdictional, not ownership of the land, the jurisdiction of the land into the city of Dania Beach to replace some of the lost tax revenue. But airport zoning creates this tension. A city or a county will own an airport, and they might or might not be the jurisdiction that has zoning control over the area around the airport. So their interests come into conflict. The airport operator wants to expand, they want to maximize the use of millions of dollars that have been invested in the airport to grow, to create more jobs, and residential areas typically around the airport fight the expansion of the airport. So it just goes on and on.
So I have a question, so when they, did the tanking thing for Dania Beach, that would be a legislative action, right?
It was,
Okay.
yes. Yeah, it was. There's a statute in Florida that allows cities to annex unincorporated land under certain criteria, but one of them is that they be contiguous land. And this was a leapfrog. So only the legislature could do this, and they did. The parties went to the legislature with a special bill, and the annexation was done.
So it's not even, so that the land isn't touching at all?
I don't think that the land in Port Everglades that's within Dania touches the rest of Dania.
Oh, wow.
It might touch, it might be considered contiguous because it's adjacent to US 1, and US 1 provides like a connector to the rest of Dania, so it might be technically considered adjacent or contiguous.
Let's see what that looks like on a map.
But it was an interesting time, because I was representing the airport during some of that. So as the airport landowner, whoever owns the airport, a city, county, whatever, as they seek to expand or enlarge the footprint or grow the size of the terminal, that's going to bring more traffic to an airport, it creates this tension. But this statute in Florida kind of takes the presumption that controlling zoning is for the purpose of protecting the investment in the airport so that the airport can continue to function. Some of the uses and some of the ways that protect airspace and development near airports to protect both the safety of aircraft operations and people on the ground, and both should be protected to the extent possible by using police power without compensation. This is a summary of what is found in Chapter 333 Florida Statutes. This is reference to the FAA regulations that this is based on. So what is it about airport operations that affects adjacent lands? Okay, the height of buildings, right? You see the lights that are on buildings, you know, hotels and so on that are in the vicinity of the airport. So the safety comes from these things. Buildings that intrude into the protected airspace that's used by aircraft, lighting of those buildings, the accumulation or the attraction of large numbers of people at the end of a runway where an accident, frankly, is most likely. So churches, schools, hospitals, these assemblages of people are all prohibited in the area that's immediately off the end of a runway. Here in Florida, where there was a lot of land available, the areas immediately off the end of the runway, which are usually called runway protection zones, most of the time the airports own them now, so they can protect them simply because they own them. But you go to more congested areas, and those RPZs, are privately owned. So then the airport is in the business of trying to eliminate the things from those areas that are the most dangerous. Collecting school children right in the area that statistically is most likely to have an aircraft accident, not a good look. And then noise. So that's the other side of it. There are safety things, tall trees, tall buildings, improperly lit buildings that make it unsafe for aircraft to operate. And then there is noise. So the EPA has something to say about what a safe noise level is for people, for residential areas. And they and the FAA have disagreed over time. They've wanted quieter areas. The FAA has said, we can't, it's like, they fought over it. The EPA would send comments on environmental studies that suggested that a much quieter standard should be in place for residential areas than the FAA. So the FAA uses a system that takes daytime noise and nighttime noise and heavily weights the nighttime noise and then averages them. So it's called DNL, day-night level. You don't have to know any of this for a test. This is just geeky airport stuff that interests me, sorry. But, so the FAA has a standard 65 DNL it's called, and they can measure it. They can measure it, but usually they don't. They usually model it. They put into a computer system the number of flights and the types of aircraft that use a particular runway, and it generates a squiggly line around an airport of the 65 DNL. They can go put microphones in the field and test it, but really the 65 DNL, that is the line that says you shouldn't have residential use within this amoeba shape around the runway, that's done by modeling, not by listening to the noise out in the field. And that's another area of disagreement between community activists and airport folks. Why don't you take the data right from the microphones that you put in the field? You're kind of like, because we don't know if it's an aircraft that spikes that sound or a pickup truck that went roaring through on any given day. So that's another battle between airport development advocates and slow down airport development community activists. And it happens around all kinds of growing airports, and almost all airports are growing, so it happens at most airports, these kind of battles. The other way in which development interests and aviation interests can collide, I shouldn't have put it that way, not collide. Their interests can come into conflict, God forbid, no colliding, is with radio, is with tower shadowing. So y'all know that there's, an air traffic control tower at the airport, and they follow all the aircraft on radar, and now they're trying to shift to GPS-based systems called Next Gen, which would be more accurate. But nonetheless, they're dealing with radar. Buildings create not just a physical impediment to that radar reading, but they can create shadowing that prevents the air traffic control systems from tracking aircraft adequately. So downtown Miami, buildings in Doral, they can become, their height can be limited, their design and their layout can be affected by a need to avoid interfering with the radar systems that track aircraft. Even though you wouldn't think of them as being close enough to an airport to have any of this affect them at all. So, safety of people on the aircraft and on the ground, right? So height of trees, buildings, lighting, all of that is in play. Noise, how close are you going to allow residential and other noise-sensitive uses to be located near an airport? From the airport's perspective, they're like, please, please don't build, please, we don't want to have to buy you out 15 years from now. And we don't want to listen to your complaint 30 years from now, so just don't build a house that close. And then we've got radio transmitter issues, and the other kind of sensitive use that comes into conflict with airport development is schools. Under Florida law, there is a prohibition on having a school within 5,000 feet of the end of a runway, period, end. It doesn't matter if it's a big runway, little runway, busy runway, never used runway, school. And it's not and planning types who are looking at the development of a charter school, let's say, and airport planning types don't necessarily communicate. One of them works for the airport, the other one works for the planning department. They don't share information. And this is a case that I got involved with. A charter school was literally built and ready to get its CO when the airport planner popped up and said, you're like 3,900 feet from the end of this little runway at this Lake Worth General Aviation Airport that nobody ever uses. You can't build it. You can't open it.
What if they shorten the runway?
Well, I'll get to that in a second. So, geeky airport, geeky stuff. I really like airports. So we got involved in trying to get a variance, and we did successfully get a variance to allow the charter school to open, in part because it was not a heavily used runway, and it was a little aircraft anyway. It wasn't like you know,
A Cessna will take down a
Or
charter
like
school.
jets.
A Cessna going into a charter school, it's not gonna be great.
no. But we are talking like 4,000 feet instead of 5,000 feet. You know, it wasn't like right there either. But it's just a black and white rule in that statute that has no wiggle room unless you go through a variance process. There is a variance process. It was very, very difficult. But the county, Palm Beach County in that case, was kind of the one that had failed to coordinate. So they were motivated to help us solve the problem. And then, as a result of a number of these, I got involved in a task force that FDOT put together to propose modifications to Chapter 333. And we did, and we met many times, and we worked very hard, and it went, and it never got adopted. And making that school, you know, that school a little more flexible was one of the things that we worked on. But, so what was your question? What was?
Was it a school?
It was a charter school that was, yeah.
When they tried to get it changed, you tried to get the school, like,
I think I tried to get schools out of that flat bar, yeah. I think I did. So every local government with protected airspace within its jurisdiction is required to adopt airport zoning consistent with Chapter 333. When airport zones impact multiple jurisdictions, like around, for example, Fort Lauderdale, Hollywood International, you've got Hollywood to the west, Dania to the south, Fort Lauderdale to the north. So the environs of the airport are in multiple jurisdictions. The statute requires them to create a multi-jurisdictional airport zoning board, but most of them never do. Here in Broward, they never did. They require a development review process where tall structures, buildings or trees are reviewed for compliance with the height restrictions. The airport runway protection zones are generally, they try to get control of the use if they don't actually own them as an airport. Regulation and location of educational facilities and residential development. Oh, and the other thing is bird attracting uses. So the end of a runway might seem like a great place for a nice little wetland, but it's not, because that attracts birds. And birds, we all watched the movie about the plane that went down after a bird strike, right? In the Hudson, yes. So birds, anything, a landfill, or even a natural area that's going to attract birds is a no-no at the end of a runway. So this is like just airport people are, it's a very technical business they're in, and this is a very detailed process of reviewing. There are state aviation planners, and there are aviation planners at airports themselves, and they all speak some language that I don't understand, to people in windowless rooms who review airspace, who do airspace analysis for the FAA. So it's all very myopic, and they have a very specific technical review that they go through. So leave it to an airport to make something that's already complicated even more complicated. But this, I did want you to see. This is an example. I was talking about the amoeba that appears around an airport for these DNL levels, the sound levels, day-night average sound levels. So this is what I mean by it. The shape, when the traffic at the airport is put into this model, it generates these kind of things to give the planners an idea of which areas around the airport need to have this consideration in planning.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, do they do anything with flight paths, like when they're coming? Oh, they do.
Yeah, anybody I live in Davie, so I got notices from neighborhood associations in the town of Davie that the FAA was changing flight patterns into Fort Lauderdale that would concentrate them, that would like narrow the flight path. Right now, the flight path can veer off north or south much sooner, so they're going to keep them in a tighter path. I didn't go to any of the meetings. Beyond that, I don't know. But that FAA action triggered this requirement. I don't know if they needed to do it under NEPA, but it did kick off a series of public meetings and public informational meetings to inform affected neighborhoods about the change to the flight paths and what the effect might be on them. Yeah, there was a lot of, on that Nextdoor app, I was seeing a lot of angry neighbors, and I'm like, I'm just staying out of this. But the airport zoning analysis is different than the analysis that you and I are going to go through when we're considering buying a piece of property, right? We're going to go and find the property on the city's zoning map, and we're going to look up the permitted uses, and we're going to look at the dimensional standards to find out how tall we can build and what kind of uses we can have. But airport zoning is three-dimensional, okay? If this is a runway, the protected airspace heads up from around the runway in a certain ratio. So the farther away you get, the more height might be possible. And it's affected by not just the shape of the runway, but things that the airport can change, like we're going to displace the end of this runway. That doesn't mean that they're going to tear up the pavement. It just means that in the notice to airmen information that they give to pilots, they're going to tell the pilots they really only have this much space to land and take off. So the airport can shift it around on the airport layout plan that's used by pilots without actually physically changing anything. So a city planner gets a development proposal for something over here. They don't know precisely what height can be permitted there by the airport. They've got to ask an airport planner, and it's that communication that breaks down. And it's just something to keep in the back of your head. Know where the airports are. You know, when you're looking at development proposals, just let it linger back there and find out, where is the airport? What are the protected airspace issues that I might encounter? Because the sooner you learn about them, the better. You don't want to be ready for your CO and then have the airport pop up and say, you can't have a building that tall there after you've already built it because the planner and the building official downtown didn't know about the airport issues. So airport zoning is three-dimensional, makes it a little more complicated. It can be affected by things that change on the use of the airfield that your average schmo opening up the zoning code is not going to be able to discern. So you need to get the right expertise. This is another example of, this is kind of showing where the runways are and what the overflight areas are for another particular airport. In some parts of the state, like Jacksonville and Tampa, there are military air bases also. And there is a requirement in state law that military airfields coordinate with the local government under the comprehensive planning that's done under Chapter 163. And again, if I tell you that airport people, when confronted with concerns by cities, always think airports win. You know, airports are more important. It's people crash and burn if we don't run the airport right. Airport issues always win. That's the perspective. Take it one step further, and that's military airports. They're even more insistent that military concerns should prevail in every discussion, and they don't even really understand why they're being made to discuss it with you. Military aviation has very strong feelings about doing it the way that they need to for safety. So what happens if, for example, this coordination did not occur, and residential development pops up all around an airport, and the airport continues to grow as airports do, and it creates more noise than is really compatible with this residential development. The question is, what can be done to solve the problem? You've got hundreds, maybe thousands of people living in homes in areas that are noisier than should be good for their health. How do you solve that conflict once it comes into, once it happens? So there are programs that the FAA has. It's under regulations that are called Part 150, where the FAA will partially pay for, and they'll support the airport expending its own money to pay for a study to, remember the amoeba around the airfield, to do a study to figure out what areas have existing land use that is incompatible with the airport. So they'll help pay for the study, and if the study concludes that there are residences in noisy areas that should be assisted in some way, then the FAA and the airport can jointly pay for some programs. Noise mitigation. Noise mitigation involves the airport actually paying for sound insulation, new windows and doors, central air conditioning for a house that perhaps didn't have central air conditioning before, to mitigate the effect of aircraft noise, and yet allow the residential use to remain in place. Yeah.
How similar is that to what happens along interstate highways with those sound deadening walls?
It's the same concept.
Okay.
That the government will do things to help mitigate the effect of the government facility on the residential area. It's the same principle. It's a little trickier because you're actually going in, hiring a contractor to go in and work on someone's house. You know, there's a certain intrusiveness to that if they're not happy with something about it. And in areas like South Florida, there can be a high degree of rejection of this kind of work because people feel that they moved to Florida so that they could live outside, so that they could enjoy the outside of their property. But with aircraft flying over every 10 minutes, they get driven inside. They're like, yeah, it's quieter in my house when you're done, but I didn't want to stay in my house all the time. I would live in Chicago if I wanted to live indoors. So the other thing that can be done to mitigate is operational changes, restricted flight schedules, and so on. In some airports that have multiple runways, one runway might be decommissioned for jet use or decommissioned in the evening to mitigate the effect of noise. That's a battle because the FAA, the guys who are sitting there, the men and women who sit in the air traffic control towers are like, you know, screw you. If I've got somebody declaring an emergency, I'm going to put them on any runway they need. So don't tell me to turn off the lights, you know, if I need to bring someone in on a particular runway for an emergency. So they feel very strongly about it. And it can be difficult to get buy-in across the different operating sections of the FAA, even for something like this. And then what we're primarily talking about, the land use regulation to limit future conflicts. So sometimes an airport will actually not just mitigate by soundproofing homes, they'll condemn or buy out the residential use, demolish the residential use, deed restrict it or rezone it or both for only commercial industrial use, and then put it back on the market. And then the money from that is supposed to flow back into the pot that pays for noise mitigation, is the theory of how it works. And property acquisition. I mean, the federal government and the local government that might own the airport, they all have the power of eminent domain. If they can find no other way to get rid of a tall tower that's creating a hazard, they can condemn it and demolish it and solve the problem that way.
Because what about an airport that's like in a city?
With that one?
Like that's in a city. Because I'm thinking of the example of Reagan National Airport in DC. It's a block of Potomac, so it can't. It's right next to the city, like downtown Roslyn.
Got no room to
So
expand.
There's no room to, even if they are expanding,
Mhm.
because they have to go through excavation for the Potomac River, but, in terms of noise, how can you even control that really? Cause it's like, cause cities are loud anyway, but.
The battle comes over in some like the New York airports have slot control, you know? So they actually control the number of flights,
Okay.
is one way. And, but it's true, once an airport becomes like landlocked, and Fort Lauderdale is certainly landlocked. There's, you know, there's US 1, there's 595, there's I-95,
Yeah.
and it's a very small airport for the number of flights that it handles, and that can be true. Have you ever flown into Midway? Anybody flown into Midway in Chicago?
Oh, yeah.
Oh my goodness, it's almost like you're parachuting in. It's like it's such a small airfield, and when you're landing, I swear I can tell you what color somebody's drapes are. That there are
Every time I
multifamily
fly in,
apartments.
I make sure to have a couple of drinks on before landing.
Well, I was on a flight into Midway, and my seatmate was a pilot from another airline. You know, he was deadheading, they give each other empty seats, and he starts gripping. He's like, I hate landing at this airport. I'm like, you say that? A pilot? Because I hate landing at this airport. I'm like, oh my goodness. So, but I always went to Midway because
It's
it's
the
cheaper.
same way, because I know years ago, like, I think I was born at this point, but, yeah, I think it's like a long time ago, but there's bridges that connect Virginia to DC, and one of the bridges that's closest to the airport, like the edge, like, I think the closest to the, Lincoln, plane crashed into it. And so, it was really like, because it's not a big space for the plane, because there's so many high rises in Arlington, so that they can't fly over but so much. I know when I lived in downtown Arlington, the planes used to come like right past our building and stuff. So you can't, like, and there was complaints about that, but like you can't do much.
No, the
It's
tolerance.
free to fly into, but.
I mean, I used to, I shouldn't laugh, but I looked at when I worked for the airport, and I looked at the Part 150 study and the number of residential units that were in the noisy area, the 65 DNL. It just really wasn't that many, honestly. Because when you look at Midway, you look at Reagan, there's thousands of people who live in those noisy areas, and I feel like, you know, telling my neighbors, you bunch of whiners, come on. So yes, many airports have these kind of constrained situations, and it creates this conflict between the existing residential use and the growth of the airport, because airports always grow. I mean, after 9/11, the aviation industry went into a serious slump, yes, but it always comes back. Airports always grow. So it's a conflict. If you look at, you should look on Google Earth sometime at the airport in the British Virgin Islands.
Where it flies right over the beach.
And then there's just it's just mountainous around the airfield. It's like hard to imagine how the pilots get in and out, but they do. So it's but it brings, and I mention this not just because I'm an airport geek, but I am, but because it illustrates the kind of policy conflict that you encounter in a development program. People have an interest in things staying the way they are. Other people have an interest in development and growth because of economics and everything else. And those are always going to come into conflict. Don't ever think that you're going to avoid it. It's always, the conflict's always going to be there, and they're always going to look, the opponents of the development will always look for the most quantifiable thing they can to put forward as the reason not to develop. Parking can be counted, traffic can be counted, noise can be measured. These things that have numbers associated with them, the opponents will grab onto and say, this is the reason you shouldn't approve this development, so just get ahead of them. get an understanding of them, do your work in the neighborhood ahead of time to find out what those hot buttons are going to be, so that you can develop, truthful analysis for them. It's not going to be 75 DNL, it's only going to be 60 because you have the data. So that's really the purpose of it. But ultimately, an airport or a local government can go through a voluntary noise mitigation program. Some of the other mitigation programs will involve a voluntary relocation. So the airport will pay for some sales assistance, some costs of a transaction, if somebody wants to sell their house and move away from the area, but they'll require something on the title to let the next buyer of the house know. You're close to an airport, did you notice? So this Post-Community Planning Act, so this, a few years ago, Chapter 163 on comprehensive planning was pretty dramatically changed, and I think it was 2014, and the change was called the Community Planning Act. And some things about airport planning did not really change, and it's still in the statute. Local governments are still required to update or amend their comprehensive plans to address compatibility with airports. The MPO, remember what an MPO is?
Metropolitan Planning Organization.
Yes, what does the MPO do?
It's not like a CRA or it's not like that. It's different.
It's a multi-government group that prioritizes transportation projects for the area.
Transportation?
Hmm?
It's only for transportation?
It is. It is, yeah, mostly roads, but they, the MPOs, again, city, county, all of the local governments in an area will appoint people to an MPO, and the MPO has the job of prioritizing projects that are in FDOT and the US DOT's program. Like, we're going to spend $10 million in your town, how would you like us to spend it? This road or that road? Airport master plans may be included in the transportation element of the comprehensive plan. Doesn't happen. Southwest International Regional, whatever it is in Sarasota, incorporated their airport master plan into the comprehensive plan, and I think they regretted it because airport master plans have their own regulations about how to adopt them and how to amend them.
Talking
And
about Sarasota or RSW?
SW.
SW.
Southwest, whatever Southwest Regional or Southwest International on the West Coast. of Florida.
RSW.
Hmm?
It's Fort Myers.
Okay.
Like, the good one.
I remember things and I don't remember others. So, but airport master plans have their own rules about how to amend them, and comprehensive plans have their own set of rules about how to do amendments that require public hearings and ordinance. They have to be adopted by ordinance, so you can't change them readily. So I think airports have kind of figured out that they don't want to be tied to the amendment process associated with a comprehensive plan, but some of them do. Airport zoning, this chapter 333 is still required for all local governments with airport zones within their jurisdiction. That's that airspace, that oddly shaped three-dimensional airspace around the airfield. And even after 163 was amended, chapter 333 was not. It still remains in place. It's at this time that I wrote this slide, it was under review. That work that I did on the task force was still being worked on legislatively, but I think it's been abandoned at this point. Okay. Community development districts. Have any of you encountered a community development district? You don't have, does anybody live in Weston? No? Live in the Turtle Run area of Coral Springs? No? In a golf community? No? So, community development districts. They are, in Florida, it's a concept that you'll find duplicated in other states too. It's a creature that's created by state law, the process begins with a petition to create a district. So it's really, community development districts are really a financing mechanism for a developer of a very large scale development to fund the building of the infrastructure for a large phase development. Because they can issue bonds that get repaid over time, and then instead of the developer, you know, let's say it's going to cost $100 to build all the infrastructure, the developer doesn't have to borrow the $100 and pay the whole $100 back. The developer will pay on it as long as they own the property, but as they sell it off, the repayment of that $100 gets filtered down to the ultimate users of the property. So it's a way of financing infrastructure. But it requires participation. You have to go through a petition with the local government. Yeah.
Does the bonds already eventually fall off, or that's for the life of the property?
Most of them have a specific,
And they,
like 30 years, you know, 20 years, 30 years, something like that. Yes. And then
It's like a special tax district.
it is, but it's more, it is initiated by a property owner.
Is it a line item on a residence tax?
You will, yes, you will see it. You'll see on a tax bill, you'll see special assessments. If there's CDD, if the CDD is collecting, it's through that mechanism, then you'll see it on the tax bill.
Can you get assessments from any of them? Can hit you with an assessment?
There's procedures that have to, that the city, so here with the CDD, at the time that a CDD is created, a developer is the single property owner. And they're asking the city to approve their petition to create the CDD, to create the financing mechanism. With special assessments, the land is already in, you know, disparate ownership, and the city develops a plan of improvements. They get an engineering report on what it would cost to build the improvements, and then they go meet with they try to convince the people who are going to pay for it that it's going to provide enough benefit, and they have to show that legally the improvements do create a special benefit for the assessed property owners, or else the special assessment won't be valid. So I got a call from a client. They'd had the notice of the special assessment for weeks and called me 2 days before the public hearing. And they were included, their property was included in a special assessment area in a city, and it would have hit them with like a $60,000 a year special assessment. And they wanted to fight it. So it was like a really quick trying to get up to speed and figure out on what basis we could challenge it. And in fact, I and several other, you know, property owners, lawyers showed up and complained at the public hearing, and the city staff had to sort of confess that no, they hadn't met with any of us. They'd met with some other people who said they liked the idea, but it wasn't these property owners. So they ended up shelving the whole special assessment for a while.
$60,000 a person, a house?
It wasn't a house. It was for this commercial property.
Ah.
It was done on per square footage of commercial property. Okay. So CDDs, large landowners, they can petition a local government to create a CDD because it creates a mechanism for them to finance infrastructure, and then when they're ready to start selling off pods to builders or homes to owners or office buildings to office building owners, they can pass the remaining payment obligations on to the ultimate user. They have to be run kind of like a governmental body. They have to have a board. The board has to act in the best interest of the CDD. They have to act in the public. They have to keep public records. We're going to hit public records, I bet. So these are the powers: to finance and construct community infrastructure. They can impose ad valorem taxes or special assessments, issue and sell bonds based on the revenue stream from those taxes. They can adopt development rules themselves and adopt budgets. They can hire managers and contractors. So some CDDs sort of do their job and go away, you know, but some of them will continue as a quasi-governmental layer. In Weston, there is the Bonaventure Development District. The city commission is actually the board of supervisors of the development district now, but it still continues to function. I mentioned Turtle Run in Coral Springs. It was a community development district. It still continues to function as like similar to the commercial version of an HOA. You know, they have architectural standards. They have higher standards than the city would impose, that they impose on the property owners. So if property is within a CDD and therefore it's subject to these additional taxes and assessments, that must be disclosed in the deed. So you might not know what it means, but it's there. CDDs, again, they can probably act in a very ad hoc way and get away with it, but under the statute, they are supposed to adopt a plan of improvements. They're not supposed to just make it up as they go along. It requires an engineer's report. These are very similar criteria to what a city has to go through before they can impose special assessments. So they're very parallel processes. One of them is a city, one of them is a private developer that functions through the board of a CDD. There's usually a preliminary assessment rule, and then people like me come in and complain about it, pick holes in it, and say why it doesn't comply with the statute. And then there's a final, after they make adjustments, after a public hearing to hear everybody's complaints. And this is what I mean. It allows this developer to hand over the infrastructure costs to the end users. And because a CDD is created under this authority of a statute, and it has these governance requirements, it means that the bonds will have a quality that makes them eligible for institutional investors. You know, there are pension plans and other investors who they've got millions of dollars they're collecting that they have to invest in profitable investments, and they have very high standards as to what kind of securities, meaning, you know, both bonds and
Very low yields. Low yield.
they tend to be low yield because they have to have a high safety factor. But CDD bonds can meet those standards, which means that investment, the more cautious investment advisors can put their clients' money into these.
But the cost of those revenue bonds are they geo bonds at that point? If they're CDD?
No, they're never going to be general obligation bonds. They're always going to be limited to the revenue stream created for the CDD.
If they the cost of that bond issuance, that's pushed onto the homeowner at time, or the property owner at the time.
It's rolled into it's rolled into the amount that gets repaid by the taxes or assessments. Yes.
So not only do they not have to pay the infrastructure fees, they pass that on to the people who are living there, but also they have this cheap basis, or cheaper capital, because they're able to tie in with the...
And all of the money they spend before the CDD bonds are sold gets refunded. You know what I mean? So if a developer spends $3 million on infrastructure before they get the whole CDD
You're not
system,
in your pocket anymore for that.
then they borrow $10 million and repay themselves $3 million. You know what I mean? It all gets rolled into the assessments that are going to be paid by the ultimate end users. But it provides consistent revenue streams. So it ensures, let's look at it from the good of the community. It ensures funding is available to build high quality infrastructure. So nobody's going to build a 1,000-acre development on the cheap with inadequate roads, water, and sewer, and say that was the best they could afford, so to speak, because they have mechanisms to go to the market and get funding for high quality infrastructure. that's gonna last 30, 40, 50 years instead of 10 or 15. In theory. Anyway, I'm just trying to give you the other side of, yes, there's a burden on the ultimate property owners to pay off these debts, but it's for the infrastructure that serves their property and the infrastructure that gives their property higher value. So there's always a benefit too.
If you leave it to the developer, they're gonna skimp out, stabilize, and leave.
Yes. Yes. No, it's true. It's true. So this provides benefits to developers, yes, but it also provides a benefit to the community, which is why legislatures adopt these kind of statutes. All right, so that's that. Okay, it's early.
Those hard to start, the CDD, like Weston,
Well, like I said, it requires a petition. I mean, we can,
success rate.
um,
Seems like a large-scale project, just to put one of these together, has to be a decent size.
yeah, there haven't been new ones in Broward here in a very long time, because we're pretty much built out. But I see lots of our public finance lawyers doing CDDs in other parts of the state and other parts of the country where there's still a lot of vacant land available for development. So it's still utilized. But you have to make some initial investment in the plan for the infrastructure, having the engineer prepare reports that are going to show the feasibility of it, and try to get your arms around the cost. I mean, the longer these things go on, the more the costs, run up.
To kind of go on a little tangent, even though there were revenue bonds issued for the Bright Line, something that we talked about, do you know any of the land use kind of problems that are going on? Are you up to, because I know there's probably a lot going up the coast. It's interesting, I don't know.
Well, I mean, the Bright Line launching in Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach, was one thing, but the extension up to Orlando has been a battle. So why do you think that there's opposition?
People are going to get ran right through. Their town's going to get passed by.
Yeah.
That and environmental reasons, because you're going through the Everglades. Partially, right?
Not at all. Zero.
What's I don't know where
Totally different side of that
So
state.
if you're a commissioner,
I know.
if you're an elected official in Indian River County,
I just know it goes through like the turnpike area, right?
Different side of the state.
not the Everglades, but they're probably undeveloped areas, yes. But it's true, okay, nobody wants the trains whizzing by with no stop in their neighborhood and the associated economic development. They might say what they're worried about is the safety of those trains killing people and the flora and fauna that are going to be negatively affected by the train. But what they really mean is, we'd like you to put a stop here so that we can have economic development, so we get a benefit out of this high-speed rail line, not just a negative. But I like the idea of taking a train to Orlando.
So much better.
I wouldn't like the idea if I had to stop 8 times,
No, I would
right?
not go anymore. No.
No, you can have a fast
It's a
one
fast
and,
Right.
one that does stops everywhere.
But then you need 2 tracks,
But they're going the same.
which means you're going to hurt more birds and
No,
bunnies.
you could run them both in the same track. They do that in New York.
Do that?
Yeah, you have
Well,
like
you
an
gotta have
express
sun.
train. It's it runs the same line. It's a 2, and one skips stops, and one stops at every stop.
On the same line.
Well,
They'd have to go
They
on
have
there.
like separate
Yeah.
little.
To the
junctions
station.
every
Just on
once
the
in a
station,
while.
that's when they.
Wow, I'm like having a flashback. I'm trying to remember. My son loved Thomas the Tank Engine.
I
I'm
still
trying to
do.
remember
Then
the
the blue
side
the
rails.
blue train?
Yeah, the blue one. So that's it. They feel like they're getting the negative of the Bright Line, but they're not getting any of the positives. So they throw. I think they're in the clear now. I mean, I think
They got over it.
yeah. It was, and they thought
I want to go to
they one of the ways that they opposed it was opposing the issuance of the bonds.
Oh,
They made it like to get the bonds issued.
anytime a local government, and I don't know, I guess this is true of other quasi-governmental, like industrial and development bonds, you have to go to the circuit court judge and get the bonds validated. You have to go make the case that the issuance of the bonds comply with law. And so they have opposed, I think they opposed the validation of the bonds, and they slowed it down for a while that way. But I think they're in the clear now. I still haven't been on Brightline. Have you guys been on Brightline?
Oh, you're missing out.
Was it fun?
Yeah.
Amazing experience.
Oh, really?
Great.
Yeah.
Did you?
I
They're
took my
having
Brightline V card.
they're having rum, like special
This is
rum
working.
trains.
Banana night. there's
Yes,
banana
yes, that
night.
was it. So they're trying to create an experience on the train, not just have transportation, but yes, I'm trying to put together an event for the women lawyers in my office to go up to West Palm on the train together, and it always involves a cocktail party, so cocktail party and so the Brightline was started, the FEC, the railroad, the track that Brightline runs on is owned by the FEC. The track that Tri-Rail runs on was owned by Amtrak.
Okay.
Or controlled by Amtrak. I think that the state might have actually bought the line now, but Amtrak still has these run. So it was two different existing railroad lines. And the Brightline, of course, the purpose was to get into the downtowns. You know, when I lived in Delray Beach, when a big project on I-95 was started that caused them to create Tri-Rail to begin with as an alternative to the I-95 project. So I would ride Tri-Rail in its early days sometimes, and it was a nightmare to get, because the busing from the I-95 location of that into the downtown was erratic and unpredictable and horrible, and it was just, so the Brightline was get into the downtown, be part of that urban redevelopment, and at their locations, they're trying to be a catalyst for mixed-use development around their stations, right? The one in Miami has developed. It has like residential and commercial and everything all around it, doesn't it?
And they're planning like 90-story
Chick-fil-A.
super towers
Oh,
yeah.
coming up in the next couple of years. So
Yeah, I think my
There's a Chick-fil-A
colleagues,
down there, but it's like a
real
pop-up.
estate colleagues in Miami did the complex work of creating this
We had a guest speaker.
subdivision, like vertical subdivision. And you have to divide, it's just like a regular subdivision, but in the air. So you have to get surveyors to define the air that each of the owners.
He
We
was
had
talking
the
about
guest
that,
speaker
yeah,
last semester who actually was on the
working
project.
on the finances.
Oh, yeah?
project that-
Do you remember the name?
Chad something, Chad,
Maxi.
oh, Maxie, yeah, Chad Maxie.
So long. Yeah.
Well, my partners Gary Saul and a couple others in Miami probably did the real estate work for it. So that's it with community developers. We talked about Brightline.
Yep.
Let's talk about so Brightline is kind of a disruptive factor in the development scenarios in downtowns. What are other industries going on right now, developing industries that could become disruptors to the normal pattern of land development? Like innovative, new technology,
Autonomous
new business, autonomous cars.
Yep.
Yes, like that. What are some? So how are autonomous cars going to disrupt the development pattern?
I kind of, when we were at a ULI event, they talked about having, even though this is not directly related to autonomous cars, they talked about just having like a fleet of cars in the building as an amenity, and that'll kind of reduce the parking requirements for developments going forward. And then you got these retail strip centers that are going to have to kind of accommodate maybe less parking for cars that are driving themselves. It's crazy.
Okay.
I was at the same event, so, yeah.
Who wasn't?
Yeah.
Public trolleys also, for example.
So light rail, light forms of mass transit, they need space, right? They need pavement, they need their own infrastructure, so that can, did any of you guys follow the story of the wave in downtown Fort Lauderdale? Okay, the Downtown Development Authority and the City of Fort Lauderdale and Broward County had put a lot of money into development of plans for the wave.
Was it like a trolley?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I read about that.
Yeah,
Was
streetcar
that
kind of.
canceled? Was that canceled?
Yeah.
Awesome.
It totally got canceled.
It's in their, the
There-
thing you wanted us to read, it's for the city of Fort Lauderdale.
Okay.
They talk about
Is
it
it-
in there, yeah.
Yeah, so there was an election. And the city of Fort Lauderdale, the city commission completely lost its political will as a result of the election for the wave. And, you know, you have to say, the price kept escalating and escalating. And, you know, there's still exposés. It's like, I think I still read something in a local news report about people associated with the Downtown Development Authority were buying land that would be benefited by the wave, you know, and is that a problem or not? Buying in the way of the wave. But the wave has been canceled. So mass transit that you think is really a necessary component to a dense downtown brings its own problems, right? And never pays for itself and has a huge infrastructure expense. And it's hard to just simply find room for it. When you know you can't take a lane for a light rail line and lose that lane for other traffic because you can't just miraculously eliminate half the traffic to make room, you know, there's a lot of conflict. So anything else, other autonomous cars, the attempt to have light rail programs, anything else come to mind?
Biking and the new
Scooters.
They're so dangerous.
I get
The
so
things that I
harassed.
absolutely hate.
I don't drive out there anymore.
Always,
kill
because they
one.
just come on and
I
go
love those
scooter.
things.
I like driving on them.
I did one to
But
watch
I
it.
wouldn't.
I hate how they go the wrong way down one ways.
The girl just like ran into the back of this lady and like she like flipped and then like fell on her
I would
ass.
fall down
Like
walking.
hit
Why would I
someone's
be on
car
the
or
Like,
hit
hit
a
her.
pedestrian?
A pedestrian hit her. Like,
Yeah.
she was just
Was
like,
it at night,
It was
like
at
during the
night.
drinking hours, or was it during the day?
It's always drinking hours down there.
It was at night?
Yeah, but she was not, she was sober. You could tell, like, because she just didn't know how to work the scooter. It was her first time on it, because she was like really loud about it.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, she finally got like, it to start and stuff, and it just went too fast.
Yes, I have the pleasure of representing Bolt when they got the first scooter license in the city of Fort Lauderdale.
Those are the yellow ones,
Those are the
right?
yellow and black ones, yeah. They're the ones with the 2 feet, like side by side, instead of having to do it like skateboard style.
Yeah.
They
I
say
haven't
that.
seen them as much lately, at least in like the beach area of
Yeah, I
Fort
haven't
Lauderdale.
Haven't seen them in the beach
I
so
see
much.
the green ones all the time.
Yeah, the
There's
green ones are
a
the
lot
annoying
of lime,
ones.
yeah, there's a lot of lime ones
I
there.
had so much
Lime
fun
and
on
Bird
it.
were kind of the early entrants in this. I was in San Diego to visit family, Lime and Bird like all over the place in San Diego.
Guys, you wanna ride
Do you
scooters?
when you do that, do you put, like you representing them, is there like a maintenance, like they have to, because my son was on one of those, in New York, there's a whole bunch of Uber bikes all over the place. And he was on an Uber bike and the brakes were bad. And he went down a hill and got hit by a car.
Oh my God, is he okay?
Yeah, that's why he broke his foot last semester.
Is it Godson or-
Yeah.
I remember that.
Yeah. And literally the brakes were bad on the bike and he just got hit by a car.
There probably is a maintenance obligation, and there
Trust.
probably is just regular old
Yeah.
common law, you know.
Oh, yeah.
How's this built out?
Yeah.
Sorry?
But,
Stop going
so
so
scooters are a disruptor, right? They're, from the city's perspective, hopefully what they will do is take some of those Uber rides, those last mile rides off of the roadway system. So if you're going, you know, from north of the river to south of the river, you're not gonna necessarily call an Uber on a hot day. Maybe you'll grab a scooter and get yourself over the bridge and a few blocks to your next, you know, back to your office or whatever it is, instead of those, because downtown on Las Olas, they just stop in the middle, the Uber and Lyft driver, they just stop in the middle of the road for however long it takes to get these people and their luggage out of the car.
Taxis do the same.
Yeah, taxis.
A bygone era.
I'm using a taxi.
What's a taxi? Are they expensive? They're like libraries, they're extinct.
So anything else come to mind that's like a new or cutting edge technology that might have an impact on all these things that will affect parking? Yeah, parking is the tail that wags the dog in development all the time, so.
In Manhattan, for example, I've heard that Uber just announced a new service where they're actually going to be having helicopter rides from Manhattan to the airport. So instead of taking traffic,
That would
etc.
cost a lot.
Yeah, it's $200. So far from what I've heard, it's around $200. But the thing is, if you're in a helicopter and you don't have traffic, so if your last second for your flight.
I understand that, Anthony, but do you understand that's a flight ticket right there? Oh my.
I mean, I do know that, but if you're getting on a helicopter, it doesn't really matter. And for 200, it's not that bad.
You're about to miss your flight.
You're about to just like.
Okay, what are some of the, so let's say that any of these technologies have a way of getting people out of their cars a little bit. So what are the benefits? Why do you put up with the crazy period of time of people learning to use scooters? What are the benefits to the city?
Congestion, helping
Yeah, it helps
people.
us flow in cars.
Less
Yeah.
smog.
Yes, yes. Could there be a social element to this?
Yeah. I think, I know, like.
Reduced
yeah.
population.
I don't know, because people don't talk to each other nowadays anyway.
I think
Selection, natural selection.
I think as you said, like, people use more of the parks, like, people use it now to get around, to get around more, to, like, around the cities and stuff, to see more of it. I know, like, for, when I was at home recently, well, I guess not recently, last month, but people took it down the mall, because it's quicker to get to one side to the other. Because usually people are like, all right, well, I walked like a block, it's hot, I'm over it, versus like kind of taking their time to view the scenery. But I also think, I know when we were at our concert, I think, you know how people like kind of conjure after concert, and if you don't know what to do, like they like literally are lost for like a second before they try to incorporate their rides and walk to the garage. I think it kind of helps with like people leaving. I mean, I know in DC, like, if people were conjuring, there was like people worried about crimes and stuff like that. Someone would like steal something because people were just standing around, not knowing where to go. So I don't know if that would solve any of those statistics. But.
I saw a ULI program that they're doing in Miami-Dade to design the city for women, and the men will come.
That sounds
True.
Well, I mean, but the idea that women have different safety concerns, okay, being able, that women would feel more vulnerable in a city, something like a scooter, I mean, so they can, another scooter can still run into them, but things and lighting and, you know, SEPTED, the idea of design that reduces opportunities for criminal activity, is something that women are more aware of, right, than men. So design for that, and it's going to be safer for everyone, I think is the theory. Lighting. So
I think that was definitely better. I know that actually was mentioned at the last ULI board meeting, that someone said that they took a scooter like through this like dark park because it was like the shortest way to their car, versus like if they walked, you think something bad would have happened. I think it does have something to do with safety. Like
yeah,
I would, if I was walking through like a poorly lit area, yeah, I would rather get through there quicker versus
right.
like walking.
And you do have a headlight on the
exactly,
scooter.
exactly, you do.
Yeah.
So I definitely think that's
yeah. Well, and getting people out of cars so it's like being sort of an enhanced pedestrian. So you're going to encounter other people more. It creates a social interaction that cars do not, and that I think is good for public health, right? People being isolated. What is it? Someone told me, and I don't know if it's true, that in the UK they have a government minister of loneliness.
Oh, wow.
I mean, it's a form
It's
of
a health
health,
epidemic.
Yeah.
you know, to develop public health systems in a way to reduce loneliness because because it leads to depression, suicide, I mean, all other things that require pretty expensive intervention. So the social element, and that's something to think about and then I'm going to give you a break, and then you're going to come back and you're going to work together, you're going to work for a while on your presentations. So don't just disappear, come work on your presentations. But the scale of the projects that you're working on, keep those soft issues in mind. You know, is it a scale that's suitable for pedestrian use? Is it a scale that allows people with different health, different age, different family groupings to live together? Those social things, I think, are going to become more and more important because the land for development is going to become more and more constrained in these cities. Okay, take a break, come back, work on your presentations, and I will be here to assist. And there might be a little bit more lecture, so don't just disappear.
I can't do Thursday or Friday.
So we compiled it into one
I can't do Thursday or Friday. You guys all gotta go through this?
I was sick, I remember they said.
You gotta read.
No, mine took forever today.
There's no way to tell what to do.
something similar to this, more graphic. Really? Yeah, written that way.
Oh, the new.
Oh, wait, we're on a break now, right? Yeah, but I know. So how's your day? So, she didn't do what I had.
I want to see what's more content.
Oh, the content?
Yeah, to see if we have everything it is.
I was like, I thought you showed it to her. Okay.
Yes.
It's been a long week, right?
I know. Okay, so here it is.
Really? Yes, like it's
Fine.
Like whatever we do, we should resolve that.
I know.
It's made out of plastic.
You guys should.
It was only like 25
Are you looking
And then there was another time she said working groups, so she's going to just.
Yeah.
That's on you.
Before all of this.
No, I'm scared.
I'm getting all the